Picture this: a 72-year-old man, retired, with a pension barely enough to survive, buying a property for only 37 cents. Sounds too good to be true, right? Well, let me tell you that sometimes the deals that seem impossible hide secrets that are better left buried. Don Ramiro Velasquez lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Guadalajara. He had worked his entire life as an accountant for a transportation company, and when retirement finally came, he realized that his savings wouldn't be enough to fulfill his dream: to have a little piece of land, a quiet house where he could spend his final years surrounded by nature. For months, he reviewed property listings, but everything was out of his reach. Until one day, while browsing the internet, he found something that made his blood run cold and at the same time lit a spark of hope in his chest. It was a judicial auction. A cabin in the mountains of Jalisco, near a small town called San Sebastián del Oeste. The property had been abandoned for decades, and no one, absolutely no one, had bid on it. The minimum price was ridiculous, 50 cents. Don Ramiro read the description over and over. Half-hectare lot, wood and stone construction, access by dirt road. There were no recent photos, only a blurry black and white image of what appeared to be a solid structure among the trees. What caught his attention most was a note at the end of the listing, written in small letters. Property sold as is. Buyer assumes all responsibility for current condition and property history. No subsequent claims accepted. It was strange, yes, but Don Ramiro thought it was simply standard legal language. After consulting with his daughter Maria, who tried to dissuade him by saying it was probably in ruins, Don Ramiro decided to take the risk. What could he lose? On the day of the online auction, his heart was pounding as he waited for the process to begin. When they finally opened the bids, Don Ramiro bid 37 cents. He waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15. No one else made an offer. The property was his. For 37 cents, Don Ramiro Velasquez had become the owner of a cabin in the mountains. When the deed arrived by mail, he noticed something peculiar. The document had dark stains, as if it had been stored in a damp place for years. And there was a red stamp with the word caution that someone had tried to erase, but which was still visible. His daughter Maria insisted on accompanying him the first time he went to see the property. "Dad, this doesn't feel right. A house for 37 cents isn't normal. It's probably infested with rats or about to collapse." But Don Ramiro was determined. He had waited his whole life for this. He prepared his old truck, packed basic tools, supplies for a week, and most importantly, Thor, his 6-year-old golden Labrador, his faithful companion since he'd been widowed. The journey to San Sebastián del Oeste took almost 5 hours. The roads became increasingly narrow and winding as they climbed the mountain. When they finally reached the town, Don Ramiro asked at the local store for directions to his property. The store owner, a man of about 60 with a gray mustache, turned pale when he showed him the address. "You bought the cabin at Los Pinos Negros?" he asked in a trembling voice. "Sir, with all due respect, no one from town goes near that place. That property has history, bad history." Don Ramiro smiled, thinking it was just small-town superstitions. "Don't worry, friend. I don't believe in ghosts or curses. I just want a quiet place to spend my final years." The shopkeeper slowly shook his head. "It's not about ghosts, sir. It's about what happened there 40 years ago. If I were you, I'd turn around and forget that cabin exists. But if you're determined..." He gave him directions and added, "May God be with you. And don't let your dog roam free around there." The dirt road to the cabin was barely passable. Tree branches hit the sides of the truck, and at several points, Don Ramiro had to get out to move fallen logs blocking the way. Thor barked excitedly from the back window, oblivious to the growing sense of unease that was beginning to take hold of his owner. Maria rode in silence, looking at her phone that had lost signal miles ago. After 30 minutes on that hellish road, they reached a clearing in the forest. And there it was, the cabin at Los Pinos Negros. Don Ramiro stopped the truck, and all three got out slowly. The structure was much larger than they expected. 2 stories of dark wood, almost black from moisture and time, with a red tile roof that miraculously seemed intact. Windows with closed shutters, a massive oak front door with rusted hardware, and around it, a completely wild garden where weeds had grown to the height of the first-floor windows. But the most disturbing thing was the silence. Despite being in the middle of the forest, you couldn't hear a single bird singing. No buzzing insects. No whisper of wind through the leaves. Just silence. An unnatural silence that made your hair stand on end. Thor, who seconds before had been barking excitedly, now whimpered softly and pressed against Don Ramiro's legs. "Easy, boy," he said, petting his head. "It's just an old house." Maria was the first to speak. "Dad, I don't like this. Let's go, please." But Don Ramiro had already taken out the bundle of rusty keys that came with the deed. "We've come all this way, Mija. At least let's go inside and see how it is. If it's too bad, we'll leave and that's it. But I have to see it." They approached the front door. Don Ramiro tried 3 different keys before one finally turned in the lock with a metallic click that resonated like a gunshot in that oppressive silence. He pushed the door, which opened slowly with a creak of rusty hinges. A gust of cold, damp air came from inside, bringing with it a strange smell, a mixture of rotting wood, moisture, and something else, something vaguely sweet that none of them could identify. The interior was dark. Don Ramiro took out his flashlight and shone it inside. The beam of light revealed a spacious foyer with a wooden floor that, surprisingly, appeared to be in good condition. There was furniture covered with white sheets, now gray with decades of dust. An iron chandelier hung from the ceiling. The walls were decorated with floral wallpaper that was peeling in several places. "Well, it's not so bad," said Don Ramiro, trying to sound optimistic, though his voice sounded strangely hollow in that space. He entered first, followed by Maria. Thor stayed at the threshold, refusing to enter. Don Ramiro had to pull him by the collar to get him across the door, and when he finally did, the dog pressed against his legs, trembling. They walked through the ground floor, discovering room after room. A large living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a wood stove, a dining room with a long table that could easily seat 12 people, and a surprisingly modern bathroom for an old cabin. The furniture, though covered in dust, was all there, as if the former inhabitants had left one day and never returned. There were plates in the cupboard, pots hanging in the kitchen, books on the shelves. Everything intact. Everything waiting. "It's like a time capsule," Maria murmured, removing the sheet from an armchair. "Dad, look at this." She pointed to the wall above the fireplace. There was a rectangular space lighter than the rest of the wall, as if a picture had hung there for years. But the picture wasn't there. Someone had removed it. Don Ramiro continued exploring, increasingly fascinated. The cabin was in much better condition than he expected. With some cleaning, minor repairs, maybe replacing some windows, it could be perfectly habitable. His 37-cent investment was turning out to be the bargain of the century. That's when Thor began barking furiously at the stairs leading to the second floor. The dog had separated from them and was at the foot of the stairs, barking with an intensity Don Ramiro had never seen in him. It wasn't a warning bark or a playful bark. It was a bark of pure, absolute fear. "What's wrong, Thor?" Don Ramiro approached the stairs. The darkness of the second floor seemed denser, more solid. He shone his flashlight upward, but the beam of light barely penetrated that blackness. "There must be some animal up there. A raccoon or something." Maria grabbed his arm. "Dad, don't go up. Please. We've seen enough. We can come back tomorrow with more people in daylight." But Don Ramiro had already put one foot on the first step. "I'm just going to take a quick look, Mija. I need to know what condition the second floor is in." He began to climb, step by step. The wood creaked under his weight, but it felt solid. Thor stayed below, barking louder and louder, almost hysterical. When Don Ramiro reached the top of the stairs, he found himself in a hallway with 4 doors, 2 on each side. All closed. The air up there was colder, and the sweet smell was stronger. He walked to the first door on his right and turned the knob. The door opened, revealing what appeared to be a master bedroom. Canopy bed, dresser, wardrobe, all covered by that blanket of dust and time. He opened the second door. Another bedroom, smaller. The third door led to a bathroom. All normal. All empty. But when he put his hand on the knob of the fourth door, the one at the end of the hallway, something changed. The temperature dropped drastically, so much that he could see his own breath condensing in the air. The knob was frozen, so cold it almost burned his hand. And from the other side of that door, he heard something that made his heart stop, the crying of a child. It was faint, muffled, as if coming from very far away. But it was unmistakable. A child was crying on the other side of that door. "Hello," called Don Ramiro with a trembling voice. "Is anyone there?" The crying stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than the crying. An expectant silence, as if something on the other side was listening, waiting. Don Ramiro turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room on the other side was completely different from the rest of the house. While the other rooms were dusty but orderly, this one looked as if it had been destroyed by a hurricane. The furniture was overturned, there were deep scratch marks on the wooden walls, the curtains hung in tatters, and in the center of the room there was a circle drawn with something dark on the floor. Don Ramiro shone his flashlight, and his stomach turned. The circle was made with dried blood. Inside the circle were symbols he didn't recognize, letters in a language he couldn't read. And in the exact center of the circle, there was a rusted metal box, about the size of a shoebox. The lid was closed with an old padlock. "Dad!" Maria's voice came up from the ground floor. "Dad, we have to go." Thor is trying to run away. But Don Ramiro couldn't take his eyes off that box. Something inside him screamed to get out of that room, to go down the stairs, to get in his truck and never come back. But another part of him, stronger, was consumed by curiosity. What was in that box? Why was it inside a circle of blood? What had happened in this room? He slowly approached the circle. With each step he took, the air became heavier, harder to breathe. When he finally reached the edge of the circle, he hesitated. There was something deeply wrong about crossing that line of blood. Every instinct in his body told him to stop. But he extended his foot and placed it inside the circle. The moment his shoe touched the space inside the circle, all the windows in the room flew open with a deafening crash. A blast of icy wind entered, so strong it almost knocked him to the floor. And then he heard the voices. Dozens of voices whispering at once, in that same strange language that was written on the floor. The voices overlapped each other, creating a cacophony that pierced his ears. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, everything stopped. The windows closed. The wind ceased. The voices fell silent. Don Ramiro was trembling, his heart beating so hard he thought it would burst from his chest. With trembling hands, he bent down and took the metal box. It was frozen, much colder than anything he had ever touched before. "Dad, please." Maria was at the room's door, with tears running down her face. "What are you doing? We have to leave. Now." Don Ramiro stepped out of the circle with the box in his hands. "It's okay, Mija. We're leaving now. I just need to take this." They ran down the stairs. Thor was waiting for them at the front door, barking and whimpering. They left the cabin and ran to the truck. Don Ramiro threw the box in the back seat, put Thor in, and started the engine with trembling hands. He didn't look back as he left that place on the dirt road, driving much faster than was safe. Maria wouldn't stop crying. "What was that?" "What was that, Dad?" "I don't know, Mija. I don't know." But as he drove back to town, Don Ramiro couldn't stop thinking about that room, about the circle of blood, about the voices. and especially about the box now resting in the back seat of his truck. He could feel its presence, as if it emanated cold throughout the vehicle. When they arrived at San Sebastián del Oeste, the sun was already setting. They decided to spend the night at the town's only hotel before returning to Guadalajara. Don Ramiro took the box with him to the room. Maria insisted on having her own room. She needed to be alone to process what had happened. Once alone in his room, Don Ramiro placed the box on the table. Thor had curled up in a corner, as far away from the box as possible, and wouldn't stop looking at it with frightened eyes. Don Ramiro took out his tools and examined the padlock. It was old, very rusty. He could probably break it with a hammer. But something held him back. A little voice in his head telling him that there were things better left closed. That this box was sealed for a good reason. He decided to investigate first. He needed to know what had happened in that cabin. Why it had been abandoned for 40 years. Why no one from town wanted to go near it. He took out his laptop and began searching for information about the property, about Los Pinos Negros, about San Sebastián del Oeste in the 80s. What he found made his blood run cold. In 1983, the cabin had been home to a family, Rodrigo Santamaria, his wife Elena, and their 2 children, Sebastián aged 9 and Lucia aged 6. Rodrigo was a successful businessman from Guadalajara who had bought the cabin as a vacation home. According to the newspaper articles Don Ramiro found, in October 1983, the entire family disappeared. The town's employees who worked at the cabin arrived one morning and found the door open, food still on the breakfast table, but no family members. The police launched an extensive investigation. They searched the surrounding forest, dragged nearby rivers, interrogated everyone in town. But they never found a single trace of the Santamarias. The most disturbing thing was the last paragraph of the main article. Investigators report having found evidence of ritual activity in one of the second-floor rooms, including symbols of unknown origin drawn with blood on the floor. Authorities refused to comment on theories that Rodrigo Santamaria was involved in occult practices. Don Ramiro felt the room spinning. That family had disappeared in that cabin. In that same room where he had found the box. What was in that box? Did it have something to do with the Santamaria disappearance? He continued investigating and found an Unsolved Mysteries forum where people discussed the case. A user named Historiator_Jal had posted additional information. My father was a state police officer in the 80s and worked on the Santamaria case. He told me things that never made it to the newspapers. They said that when they entered that cabin, they all felt something wrong, as if the house itself was alive. They found Rodrigo Santamaria's diaries where he talked about having found something in the forest, something ancient, something that promised him power and fortune. The last days before the disappearance, he wrote that he could no longer control what he had awakened. Don Ramiro closed the laptop. His hands were trembling. He looked at the box on the table. In the hotel lamp's light, he could see that it wasn't just a rusted metal box. It had engravings on the surface, symbols similar to those he had seen on the floor of that room. His phone rang, making him jump. It was Maria. Dad, are you okay? I've been thinking, we should call the police. We should tell them what we found. And what are we going to tell them, Mija? That we felt something weird in an old house. That we found a box in a dirty room. That wasn't dirt, Dad. That was blood. There was a circle of blood on the floor. That house, something terrible happened there. Don Ramiro sighed. You're right. Tomorrow we'll go to the local authorities. We'll give them the box, tell them what we saw, and forget about all this. I'm going to lose 37 cents, but at least I'll keep my sanity. He hung up the phone and lay down on the bed, fully clothed. Thor jumped on the bed with him, something he normally didn't allow, but that night he needed the company. He turned off the light and closed his eyes, trying to sleep. But sleep didn't come, because every time he closed his eyes, he heard those whispering voices. and he felt the cold emanating from the box. Don Ramiro didn't sleep at all that night. At 3 in the morning, he got up and turned on the light. Thor raised his head, alert. The box was still there, on the table, emanating that unnatural cold. Don Ramiro approached slowly. Now that he looked at it more carefully, he could see that the symbols engraved on the surface formed a pattern, a kind of map or diagram. He took out his phone and took photos of the symbols. Then he opened a translation app and tried to identify the language. After several attempts, the app suggested it could be ancient Nahuatl, mixed with something else, something not in its database. Curiosity was like an itch he couldn't scratch. What was inside that box? Why had the Santa Maria family disappeared after bringing it to their house? Did it really contain something dangerous, or was it just an ancient relic? Don Ramiro took his hammer from the tool bag. He approached the box. He raised the hammer. "Okay, boy," he told Thor. "We're just going to see what's inside, and then we'll give it to the authorities. It can't be that bad, right?" Thor whimpered and hid under the bed. Don Ramiro struck the padlock. The rusted metal broke easily with the first impact. The padlock fell to the floor with a metallic tinkle. Don Ramiro waited, almost expecting something dramatic to happen. But nothing happened. The room remained silent. The box remained closed. With trembling hands, he lifted the lid. Inside the box were 3 things. First, a black leather diary, old and worn. Second, a black and white photograph of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 smiling children, the Santa Marias. And third, wrapped in a dark cloth, there was a small object. Don Ramiro took out the diary first. He opened it and began to read. The handwriting was tight, almost frantic in the last pages. It was Rodrigo Santa Maria's diary. The first entries were mundane, talk about his work, his family, his plans for the cabin. But as it progressed, the tone changed. Rodrigo wrote about having found a cave in the forest behind the cabin. Inside the cave there were ancient marks on the walls, symbols he couldn't understand. And in the deepest part of the cave, he found a stone idol small, the size of a fist. "The idol is beautiful," wrote Rodrigo. "It represents a deity that the natives of this region worshipped centuries ago. According to the books I've consulted, it was a god of fortune and abundance. Whoever possesses the idol will have success in all their endeavors. I've brought it to the house. Elena says it gives her a bad feeling, but I feel its power. I can feel how my luck is changing." The following entries documented the change in Rodrigo's life. His businesses prospered incredibly. He closed deals that seemed impossible. He made money like never before. But there was a price. The children say they see shadows on the walls at night. Elena found blood on the floor of Sebastian's room, but when I went to see it, it was no longer there. I'm having strange dreams. Dreams where the idol speaks to me, asks me for things. The entries became more incoherent. The idol wants an offering. It says I've taken too much without giving anything in return. But what can I give it? Money? Food? No, it wants something else. Something alive. Don Ramiro felt his skin crawl. He continued reading, though each word filled him with terror. I tried to get rid of the idol. I threw it in the river, but it appeared again in my office. I buried it in the forest, but it was on my pillow when I woke up. I can't escape from it. And now it's asking for my debt. It says I've taken so much that I must give everything in return. My family. It wants my family. The last entry was written in trembling handwriting, almost illegible. It's too late. The ritual has begun. I've locked them in the ritual room. Elena screams. The children cry. But the idol says it's the only way. That after this, I'll be free. That I'll have everything I always wanted. Forgive me, God. Forgive me. The diary ended there. Don Ramiro felt nauseous. He dropped the diary and took the dark cloth wrapping the third object. He unwrapped it slowly, and there it was, a black stone idol, the size of a fist, carved in the shape of a creature that was part human, part animal. It had horns, claws, and a mouth full of sharp teeth. The eyes were two inlaid rubies that seemed to glow with their own light. The moment his fingers touched the stone, Don Ramiro felt something. A presence. A consciousness. He wasn't alone in that room. "Hello, Ramiro," a voice whispered in his mind. Not in his ears, but directly in his brain. "You've waited so long. Let me give you what you deserve." Don Ramiro tried to drop the idol, but his fingers wouldn't respond. The stone was stuck to his skin, or his skin was stuck to the stone. The room began to spin. Images flooded his mind, his bank account multiplying by 1,000, a mansion on the beach, trips around the world, all the money and luxury he ever dreamed of. "All this can be yours," whispered the voice. "You just have to give me something in return." "What? What do you want?" Don Ramiro managed to articulate. "You already know what I want." In his mind appeared an image, Maria, his daughter, sleeping in the next room. "No!" Don Ramiro screamed, and using all his willpower, he threw the idol away from himself. The stone object flew through the air and crashed against the wall, falling behind the dresser. At that moment, the room door burst open. Maria ran in. "Dad, I heard a scream, are you?" She stopped seeing the scene. Her father on the floor, trembling, the open box on the table, papers scattered everywhere. "Maria, listen to me." Don Ramiro stood up with difficulty. "We have to destroy that. Now. Before it's too late." "Destroy what?" "Dad, what's happening?" Don Ramiro told her everything. The diary, the missing family, the cursed idol. Maria listened with increasingly wide eyes, terror painted on her face. "We have to burn it," she finally said. "Dad, we have to burn that idol and everything that was in that box." Don Ramiro nodded. But when they tried to search for the idol behind the dresser, it wasn't there. They searched the entire room, under the bed, in the closet, in the bathroom. Nothing. The idol had disappeared. "This can't be happening," Maria murmured, on the verge of panic. Objects don't just disappear. But Don Ramiro knew the truth. The idol wasn't a simple object. It was something more. Something with its own will. And now it was loose. Thor began barking furiously at the window. Don Ramiro approached and looked outside. His blood froze. In the hotel parking lot, under the dim light of the street lamps, there was a figure standing next to his truck. It was the silhouette of a tall man, motionless, looking directly at his window. Though it was too dark to see his face, Don Ramiro somehow knew the figure was smiling. "Maria," he said with a trembling voice, "pack your things. We're leaving. Now." They left the hotel at 4 in the morning. The parking lot was empty. The figure had disappeared. Don Ramiro loaded Thor into the truck. Maria got in with her suitcase, and they started off. The plan was simple. Drive straight to Guadalajara, go to the nearest church, and ask the priest to help them. If this was something demonic, they needed divine help. During the first hour of travel, everything seemed normal. The road was deserted at that early morning hour. Maria had fallen asleep in the passenger seat, exhausted by the terror of the last few hours. Thor dozed in the back seat. Don Ramiro drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying not to think about the voice he had heard in his mind, about the idol's promises, about the image of his daughter that the entity had projected. But then the strange things began. First, he noticed a car behind them. Some headlights in the distance that seemed to maintain exactly the same speed as him. He accelerated. The headlights accelerated. He reduced speed. The headlights reduced speed. He couldn't see what type of vehicle it was, only those two penetrating lights following them in the darkness. Then, the radio turned on by itself. It was off, Don Ramiro was sure of that, but suddenly it began to sound. Static at first, then voices. The same whispering voices he had heard in the cabin. Speaking in that strange language, overlapping each other. He turned off the radio, yanked the cable from the dashboard. But the voices continued, now coming from the broken speakers, impossibly. Maria woke up startled. What is that? What are those voices? I don't know. Just hang on, Mija. We're almost to the main road. We'll be safer there. But the universe had other plans. When they reached the intersection where the dirt road joined the main paved highway, they found that there was a fallen tree completely blocking the way. A huge tree that definitely wasn't there when they passed the day before. Don Ramiro stopped the truck. This can't be. This is impossible. He got out of the vehicle to inspect. The tree was real, not an illusion. He would have to turn around and find another route. But when he returned to the truck, he realized something horrible. The car that had been following them had disappeared. It wasn't behind them. It hadn't gone in another direction. It simply wasn't there anymore. Dad, look. Maria pointed to the forest on their left. Among the trees, Don Ramiro could see lights. Dozens of small lights, like candles, moving among the trees. And with the lights came figures. Human shadows walking among the trees, all heading toward them. Get in the truck. Now. Don Ramiro started the engine and turned around in reverse, so fast the tires skidded on the gravel. The figures came out of the forest and began walking toward the road. Don Ramiro accelerated in the opposite direction, back toward San Sebastián del Oeste. Maybe in town they would be safer. Maybe someone there could help them. But when they arrived at the town, they found it completely empty. The streets were deserted, all lights off. Don Ramiro honked the horn, shouted, pounded on doors. Nothing. It was as if every person in town had disappeared. Dad, this doesn't make sense. Maria was crying openly now. Where is everyone? What's happening? Don Ramiro knew. The idol. This was its power. It was playing with them, showing them what it could do. It had isolated them completely from the world. And now it was coming for what it wanted. Thor was growling at something in the darkness. Don Ramiro followed the dog's gaze and saw a figure standing in the middle of the street, about 50 meters away. It was the same silhouette he had seen in the hotel parking lot. But now it was closer, and in the light of the truck's headlights, Don Ramiro could see details he wished he hadn't seen. The figure wore an old suit from the 80s. Its face was pale, almost gray, and its eyes glowed with the same reddish gleam as the rubies in the idol. It was Rodrigo Santamaria, or what was left of him. The figure raised a hand and pointed at them. Its mouth opened, but the voice that came out wasn't human. It was the same voice Don Ramiro had heard in his mind. Ramiro, you've taken what is mine. Now you must pay the price. A life for a life. Give me the daughter, and I'll let you go free. Never. Don Ramiro hit the accelerator and drove directly toward the figure. But at the last second, the figure disappeared like smoke. The headlights illuminated an empty street. We have to go back to the cabin, said Don Ramiro suddenly. Maria looked at him as if he had gone crazy. What? No, Dad. That's precisely the last. Listen to me. It all started there. Santamaria's diary mentioned a cave behind the cabin, where he found the idol originally. If he found it there, maybe that's where it belongs. Maybe we can return it and end this. What if that's exactly what that thing wants? For us to go back to that place? Don Ramiro looked her in the eyes. We have no other choice, Mija. We're trapped here. The town is empty, the road is blocked, that thing is chasing us. Our only hope is to return the idol to where it belongs and pray that breaks its power. Maria closed her eyes, tears running down her cheeks. Then she nodded. Okay, but if we're going to do this, we do it fast. We go in, find the cave, leave that damn thing there, and get out. Agreed. Agreed. The journey back to the cabin was the longest and most terrifying of their lives. The shadows seemed to move at the edges of the road. The whispering voices never stopped sounding, filling the truck's cabin with their unnatural chanting. Thor whimpered continuously, curled up in the back seat. When they finally arrived at the clearing where the cabin was, dawn was beginning to break on the horizon. The cabin looked even more sinister in the gray light of dawn. The windows seemed like dark eyes watching them, the door a mouth waiting to swallow them. Don Ramiro opened the glove compartment and took out a flashlight and a hunting knife. "Stay close to me. No matter what you see or hear, don't separate from me." "Understood." Maria nodded. They got out of the truck. Thor refused to get out, barking hysterically from the back seat. It was better that way. At least he would be safe in the truck. They walked to the back of the cabin. Sure enough, there was a trail that went into the forest. A trail that Don Ramiro swore he hadn't noticed the day before. The path was marked with ancient stones, covered with moss and carved symbols. They followed the trail for about 10 minutes until they reached the mouth of a cave. It was a dark opening in the side of a hill, barely large enough for a person to pass through crouched. Around the entrance there were more symbols carved into the rocks. "That's where he found the idol," murmured Don Ramiro. "It has to be." They entered the cave. Don Ramiro's flashlight barely penetrated the darkness. The walls were covered with more symbols, some carved, others painted with something dark that he preferred not to examine too closely. The air was stale, smelling of damp earth and something else, something putrid. They walked deeper into the cave. The tunnel descended, increasingly steep. Don Ramiro had to help Maria down at several points. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 5 minutes, they reached a chamber. It was a circular room, about the size of a large room. The walls were completely covered with carvings, and in the center of the room there was a stone altar. On top of the altar there was a niche, perfectly carved to fit an object the size of a fist. The place where the idol had been for centuries before Rodrigo Santamaria found it. "This is it," said Don Ramiro. "This is the place." But there was a problem. They didn't have the idol. It had disappeared in the hotel. As if he had read their thoughts, Maria screamed. Don Ramiro turned and saw that his daughter was looking at something behind him. He turned slowly. There, standing on the other side of the chamber, was the figure of Rodrigo Santamaria, and in his extended hand he held the black stone idol. "You've come," said the unnatural voice. "Good. Now we'll complete what began 40 years ago. An offering for my power. An innocent life. Give me the daughter, Ramiro, and I'll give you everything you desire. Wealth, power, eternal life. Everything can be yours." Don Ramiro stood in front of Maria, protecting her. "I already told you no. I will never give you my daughter. I'd rather die." The figure smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "Then you'll both die, and your souls will feed my hunger for an eternity." The figure began walking toward them. Don Ramiro gripped his knife, though he knew it would be useless against whatever this thing was. But then something unexpected happened. A bark echoed in the cave. Thor had followed their trail. The dog ran into the chamber, placing himself between Don Ramiro and the figure, barking ferociously. The figure stepped back, genuinely surprised. "A guardian," hissed the voice. "A pure heart. Interesting." Thor wouldn't stop barking, and something strange began to happen. The symbols on the walls began to glow with a faint light. Don Ramiro remembered something he had read in Santamaria's diary. The idol has power over the corrupt, over those with greed in their hearts. But it fears the pure of spirit. Thor was pure. The dog had no greed, no selfish desires. Only unconditional love for his family. And that love was creating a barrier that the entity couldn't cross. Don Ramiro understood. "Maria, give me your crucifix. The one your mother gave you." Maria took off the chain from her neck and gave it to him. Don Ramiro held the crucifix in front of him and began to pray. He wasn't a particularly religious man, but in that moment he prayed with all his heart. He prayed for protection, for salvation, for the strength to face this evil. The figure shrieked, a high-pitched and unnatural sound. "No, you can't. The deal must be completed." "There is no deal," shouted Don Ramiro. "I never accepted anything from you, and I never will." He continued praying, slowly walking toward the figure. Thor walked beside him, still barking. The figure retreated, getting closer and closer to the altar. The symbols on the walls glowed more intensely now, and Don Ramiro realized they weren't invocation symbols. They were containment symbols. This cave wasn't a place of worship. It was a prison, and the altar was the seal. "Maria, help me push that thing toward the altar," he shouted. Father and daughter, together with Thor, advanced toward the figure. The entity fought, transforming into different forms. Rodrigo Santa Maria, then his wife Elena, then the missing children, all trying to awaken pity or guilt. But Don Ramiro maintained his determination. Finally, with one last push, the figure fell back against the altar. The idol fell from its hand and rolled toward the niche on top of the altar. The moment the black stone touched its original place, the entire cave trembled. The figure began to disintegrate, screaming and cursing in that ancient language. "This isn't over. I'll return. I always return." But its screams faded as the idol sank into the niche, sealing itself with a blinding flash of light. The symbols on the walls glowed one last time, and then went out. The cave fell silent. Don Ramiro, Maria, and Thor ran out of the cave. When they emerged, the sun was fully up. The forest looked normal now. They could hear birds singing, insects buzzing. Life had returned. They ran back to the truck and drove back to town. San Sebastián del Oeste was full of people again, everyone acting as if nothing had happened. The shopkeeper who had warned them the first day saw them pass and simply nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. They drove straight to Guadalajara without stopping. When they finally arrived home, Don Ramiro called the Public Records Office and transferred the cabin's ownership to the municipality of San Sebastián del Oeste as a donation, with the express condition that it never be sold or inhabited. The official on the phone, curiously, accepted without asking questions. That night, Don Ramiro sat with Maria and told her, "You know, Mija, sometimes bargains that seem too good to be true are. I thought I had found the deal of my life. A cabin for 37 cents. But it almost cost us everything." Maria hugged him. "What's important is that we're alive, Dad. And together." Thor barked in agreement, lying at their feet. Don Ramiro never returned to San Sebastián del Oeste. He never spoke of the cabin again. And although he lived another 15 years, he always checked the shadows of his room before sleeping, and always kept a crucifix nearby. Because he knew there are things in this world better left undisturbed. Things that have been sealed for good reasons. And somewhere, in a deep cave in the mountains of Jalisco, a black stone idol waits in its prison, hungry, waiting for the day when someone else will be foolish or desperate enough to release it again. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Every week we bring real horror stories, unsolved mysteries, and paranormal events that will make you question reality. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss any story. And tell us in the comments, would you buy a property for 37 cents? Or are some bargains just too good to be true? See you in the next story, if you dare.